The air in the Austin Convention Center was electric, thick with the smell of money and ambition. 10,000 people were on their feet, applauding, and on stage, my husband Richard, bathed in the spotlight, looked like a king. He was at the peak of his keynote address, the charismatic CEO ready to unveil the project that would make him a legend, Logix 2. "And now," he boomed, his voice echoing through the massive hall, "the moment you've been waiting for, the future of global logistics." He clicked the remote, a triumphant smile plastered on his face. From the fifth row, I watched him on the massive 8 Kelvin screens flanking the stage. My heart wasn't pounding. It was cold, steady. I lifted my phone beneath the table, my thumb hovering over a simple green button on the screen. I pressed it. On stage, Richard's smile faltered. The new logo he was expecting didn't appear. The screens flickered, the 10,000-person crowd fell silent, and then a single line of text appeared, stark and white against a black background. "You can't sell a house you never built, Rick." A collective gasp swept the room. Richard froze, his face a mask of confusion, then horror. His eyes desperately scanned the crowd, and for a terrifying second, they locked onto mine. He saw me. He knew. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. To understand how we reached that breaking point, and how that single sentence brought a tech empire to its knees, we need to go back 6 weeks, to the night I realized I wasn't just a wife. I was the architect of a castle he was trying to sell right out from under me. That night started, as these things often do, with champagne and a lie. 6 weeks before the world watched my life implode on an 8 Kelvin screen, I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, a ghost in a $1,000 dress. The room was a classic American picture of success, a sea of black ties and designer gowns, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and the low hum of powerful people making small talk. My husband Richard had insisted I wear the silver sequin number. "You have to look the part, Ellie," he'd said, kissing my cheek. The part, of course, was the CEO's wife. A silent, smiling, supportive role I had apparently been born to play. Richard was in his element, moving through the crowd with the easy grace of a man who believes the world owes him its attention. He'd clap a hand on the shoulder of some venture capitalist, laugh a booming laugh that made heads turn, and accept compliments on his company's latest quarterly earnings. People would shake my hand, their eyes already looking past me to find someone more important. "You must be so proud of him," they'd say. I'd just smile and nod, my face aching from the effort. Proud? I wasn't sure what I was anymore. The main event of the evening was a short speech from Richard, the event's biggest donor. He stepped up to the podium, a vision of tailored success. He spoke about innovation and the American dream, about building something from the ground up. He was magnetic, I'll give him that. He could sell ice to a polar bear. Then he looked right at me, a tender smile on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And of course," he said, his voice dripping with performative sincerity, "I couldn't have done any of this without my amazing wife, Eleanor. Thank you, darling, for keeping the home fires burning so I could go out and change the world." The room erupted in applause. A warm, patronizing wave of it washed over me. Keeping the home fires burning, the words landed like tiny, sharp stones. I thought of the 20-hour days in our dusty garage, the endless nights I spent fueled by cheap coffee, and a belief that the algorithms I was writing could, in fact, change the world. I thought of the lines of code I architected, the complex, elegant system that formed the very spine of his billion-dollar company. All of that sacrifice, all of that creation, reduced to a folksy Hallmark card platitude. I placed my champagne flute down on the table. The small, sharp clink of glass on linen was the only sound I made, the only protest I had left in me. Later, a woman sidled up to me, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds around her neck. It was Chloe, our COO, young, brilliant, and ambitious enough to burn a hole through steel. She was Richard's protégé, his rising star. "That was a lovely speech, wasn't it?" she said, her eyes flitting over my dress with an unnerving intensity. "Richard is just a force of nature. He has his moments," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. She took a delicate sip of her wine. "It must be so nice," she continued, her tone dripping with a sweetness that didn't fool me for a second. "Not having to worry about all the complexities of the business, just enjoying the fruits of it." I looked her straight in the eye. For a moment I wanted to tell her, I wanted to explain that the complexities she wrestled with every day were built on a foundation I laid with my own two hands. I wanted to tell her that I had forgotten more about our source code than she would ever know. Instead, I just smiled a small, cold smile. "The fruits are lovely," I said. "But you should never forget where the roots are." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she excused herself, but the insult hung in the air between us. The ride home was quiet. Richard was buzzing from the adoration, scrolling through congratulatory texts on his phone. I stared out the window at the blurred city lights, feeling a chasm opening up between us. Our house, a sterile monument of glass and white marble, felt more like a museum than a home. As Richard went to pour himself a celebratory scotch, I found my feet carrying me down a less traveled hallway. There, tucked away in an alcove like a forgotten relic, was my whiteboard. It was 6 feet tall, the original one from the garage, mounted on the wall. It was covered in the ghosts of my equations and diagrams, written in faded red and blue marker. My handwriting. The birth of it all. It was the only thing I had insisted on bringing from the old house. Richard had called it sentimental clutter. To me, it was proof, a declaration of existence. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool surface. This was the route. This was the engine he was so proudly driving. And in that moment, a cold, terrifying thought crept in. What happens when the driver forgets who built the car? That night, I lay in our California king bed, the expensive sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin. Richard was asleep beside me in seconds, snoring softly, the picture of a man without a care in the world. But I was wide awake. The casual dismissals, the condescending remarks, they were no longer just minor annoyances. They were symptoms of a deeper problem. A rot. He didn't just take the credit anymore. He believed it. He had written me out of my own story. And as I lay there in the dark, I decided it was time to pick up a pen and write myself back in. I wasn't a jealous wife looking for an affair. Not yet. I was an architect, and I needed to check the foundation of the castle I had built before the king decided to sell it for parts. So I decided to check the foundation. My inspection didn't start with secret phone calls or a hired private eye. It started where our empire truly lived, in the cold, hard, logical world of the numbers. It started on a quiet Sunday morning, my ritual for the past 20 years. While Richard was out on the golf course, networking and closing deals in the clubhouse, I was in my home office, the real boardroom, with a hot cup of black coffee and the company's soul laid bare in a series of spreadsheets. Some people might see it as a chore, but for me, balancing the books was like a meditation. It was a language I understood better than anything. Every transaction, every expense report, every invoice told a story. It was the story of our company, and I was its primary author and editor. The office was my sanctuary, a room of quiet grays and brushed steel, dominated by a massive granite desk that was always perfectly clear, save for my laptop and a single framed photo of our son Ben. From my chair, if I leaned back just right, I could see down the hall to the alcove where my old whiteboard hung. It was a constant reminder of the chaos I had once wrangled into clean, elegant order. I started, as always, with payroll and receivables, the lifeblood. Everything was clean, efficient, the system was running just as I'd designed it to. Then I moved to the executive expense accounts. This was usually the most tedious part, a blur of $500 steak dinners, first-class flights to San Francisco, and client gifts that bordered on absurd. It was the cost of doing business in Richard's world. I clicked open the corporate American Express statement for his platinum card. My eyes scanned the lines of familiar names. Morton's Steakhouse, Delta Airlines, the Ritz-Carlton, all normal. All accounted for in his calendar. I was about to sign off on it when a name I didn't recognize caught my eye. The Elysian Hotel. I paused, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. It wasn't a major chain where we had a corporate account. I did a quick search. It was a local hotel, one of those hyper-exclusive, discreet boutique places downtown, with a name whispered among the super-rich. The charge was for 2 nights in something called the Elysian Suite. The amount made my breath catch. It was more than our mortgage payment. The memo line, entered by Richard's assistant, read, "Client Entertainment, K-Tech." My mind, trained to find patterns and anomalies, went to work instantly. I pulled up Richard's calendar for the dates of the charge, 3 weeks prior. The calendar was blocked out for 2 days with a bold, simple entry, K-Tech Summit, Chicago. I sat back in my leather chair, the soft material groaning in the silent room. Chicago. The hotel was in Austin, client entertainment, but the summit was in Chicago. The data points didn't connect. The logic gate was broken. It was a bug in the system. My first thought wasn't betrayal in the romantic sense. It was a feeling of profound, almost professional offense. It was a sloppy error, an insult to the pristine, interconnected world of data I had built and maintained for 2 decades. My company, my system, didn't have bugs like this. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Who was he entertaining locally when he was supposed to be 1,000 miles away? Why the secrecy of a boutique hotel when we had accounts with every major luxury chain in the city? My mind raced through the logical possibilities. Was he being poached by a competitor? Was he making a secret side deal? The idea of an affair was there, of course, a dark shape lurking in the corner of my mind, but it was too messy, too illogical. Richard was a man who prized the appearance of perfection above all else. I looked through the glass wall of my office, down the hall to my whiteboard. I could almost see the faint, ghostly lines of my original server architecture diagrams. I built this world on a foundation of pure logic. Every action had a reaction. Every input had a predictable output. This hotel charge was a foreign piece of code, a virus entered into a closed system. And it was my job to find out what it was designed to do. Just then the door swung open. Richard stood there, glowing from his morning run, his face flushed with health and self-satisfaction. He was wearing his usual Saturday morning uniform, expensive athletic gear that made him look a decade younger. "Hey, you're up early," he said, his voice breezy. He walked over and kissed the top of my head, his scent a mix of clean sweat and expensive soap. "Still playing with your numbers?" I didn't turn from the screen. "Just balancing the books, Rick," I said, my voice perfectly even. "My brilliant CFO," he chuckled, grabbing a bottle of water from the mini fridge in the corner. "Honestly, Ellie, I don't know what I'd do without you keeping track of all this boring stuff." He took a long drink, then pointed at me with the bottle. "Don't work too hard. The Thompsons want to play a round of golf at 2. He was gone as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind a faint echo of cheerful obliviousness. Boring stuff. I stared at the line item on the screen. The Elysian Hotel. It wasn't boring. It was a loose thread, and I had a sudden, undeniable urge to pull on it just to see how much of the perfect fabric of our lives would unravel. With a deliberate, steady hand, I took a screenshot of the charge, dragged Richard's calendar entry next to it, and saved them both to a new, encrypted folder on my personal drive. I named it, simply, Project Foundation. The audit had officially begun. But the single line item in a spreadsheet was just a symptom, not the disease. A financial discrepancy could be explained away, massaged, or buried in next quarter's budget. It was a loose thread, but I knew the real story, the real truth, was never in the accounting software. It was in the code. To truly check the foundation of my castle, I had to go into the catacombs. So I waited. I waited through a painfully normal week of dinners where Richard talked about his golf game, of evenings where we'd sit in the same cavernous living room reading on our separate iPads. I smiled, I nodded, I played the part. Then, on a moonless Thursday night, after the house had fallen into a deep, quiet slumber and Richard's soft snores echoed from the master bedroom, I slipped out of bed. I didn't put on slippers. My bare feet were silent on the cold marble floors as I made my way to the heart of the house, a place Richard never went, the server room. It was a small, climate-controlled chamber off my office, my own private data center. A floor-to-ceiling rack of humming servers stood against one wall, their blinking green and amber lights casting shifting patterns in the dark. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and dust-free electronics. This room was the engine of Vance Logistics, and I was its mechanic. I sat down at the simple steel terminal in the corner, the only light in the room coming from the monitor as it flickered to life. My high-level admin access had been dormant for years. I had passed the day-to-day operations to our tech team, led by my son Ben. But I had built back doors into my own creation, secret handshakes that only the original architect would know. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicking of the keys the only sound besides the low, steady thrum of the cooling fans. I typed in a line of command line code, an old, forgotten password string based on the hexadecimal values of my son's birthday. The screen flashed, "Access granted. "Welcome, administrator." I was in. My first thought was that this was a simple case of industrial espionage. Maybe a competitor had a man on the inside. I started by searching for any communications containing the words Elysian Hotel or K-Tech. I scanned emails, internal messages, deleted files. Nothing. The system was scrubbed clean. Too clean. A complete absence of evidence is often the most damning evidence of all. It meant this wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. So I went deeper. I stopped looking for words and started looking for patterns. I pulled up the raw data transfer logs, the very heartbeat of the network. It was a waterfall of numbers, a torrent of information that would be meaningless to anyone else. But to me, it was a symphony. I could read the rhythm, sense the tempo, and something was off-key. I isolated the time frame of the hotel charge, and then I saw it, a ghost. A tiny, elegant piece of code that initiated a transfer for just 3 milliseconds every hour, on the hour. It was designed to look like a standard system diagnostic, a routine handshake with a backup server. But it wasn't our backup server. The destination IP address was masked, routed through a series of proxies from Singapore to Switzerland. The data packets themselves weren't large, but they were consistent, a slow, methodical bleed. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a brute force attack from the outside. This was an inside job, executed by someone with an intimate knowledge of the system's architecture. As I decompiled the ghost script, a wave of sickening recognition washed over me. I saw a fragment of one of my own early routing algorithms, a piece of code I had been particularly proud of, now twisted and repurposed. It was like finding a line from a love poem you once wrote being used in a blackmail letter. It was a violation. I leaned back, my mind reeling. Who had this level of access and skill? The list was terrifyingly short. There was Ben, but I dismissed that thought as quickly as it came. It was an impossibility, a violation of the laws of my personal universe. That left only 2 other people with the theoretical knowledge to pull this off, myself and Richard. But Richard hadn't written a line of code in 15 years. He couldn't have done this himself, but he could have directed it. Fueled by a new, cold dread, I tried to crack the data packets. I ran my old decryption programs, but they bounced right off. The encryption was military grade, a digital wall of impenetrable steel. I was locked out of my own creation. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the waterfall of numbers on the screen, the blinking lights of the servers reflecting in my glasses. The ghost in the machine was real. It was quietly stealing the soul of my company, piece by piece, and shipping it off to God knows where. The anger and suspicion I had felt before were gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: clarity. This wasn't about a hotel bill anymore. This was a conspiracy. This was a professional hit on my life's work, and I was completely, totally out of my depth. I couldn't fight a ghost I couldn't see. I shut down the terminal, the screen going black, leaving me alone in the humming darkness. I needed more than access. I needed a key. And as I walked out of the server room, my eyes fell on the photo of Ben on my desk, smiling in his cap and gown. He wasn't just my son, he was one of the best cybersecurity minds in the country. He had built the very firewalls that were now being used against me. He was the only one who could help me burn them down. The audit was over. The war was about to begin. But before you declare a war, you have to remember what you're fighting for. Before I could drag my own son into the heart of this mess, I needed to be absolutely certain of the territory I was defending. So, instead of calling him, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the oldest encrypted folder on my personal hard drive, the one labeled simply "The Garage," and I stepped back in time. The images flickered onto my screen, and suddenly, the smell of our sterile minimalist mansion was replaced by the ghost scent of stale coffee, soldering fumes, and the damp concrete of our first garage in a tiny suburban tract house. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess. Wires snaked across the floor like jungle vines. Monitors, bought secondhand from a university surplus sale, were propped up on stacks of textbooks in cardboard boxes. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling and the bluish glow of the screens. This wasn't just a workspace, it was a cocoon where a billion-dollar company was being born. And there I was, a version of me I barely recognized. My hair was tied back in a messy knot. I was wearing an old paint-stained university sweatshirt, and my eyes, even in the grainy photos, had a fierce, focused intensity. There's a picture of me asleep at the keyboard, my cheek pressed against the keys, a half-eaten slice of cold pizza from a Costco box on the desk beside me. I remember that night. It was the night I finally cracked the routing algorithm, the core piece of logic that could calculate the most efficient shipping route between any 2 points on the globe, factoring in weather, traffic, and 1,000 other variables. It was the breakthrough, the moment the idea became a reality. In these photos, Richard is a whirlwind of kinetic energy. He's not coding, he never was the engineer, but he's there. He's on our beat-up corded landline, his voice a smooth, charming flow of promises to a skeptical loan officer at the local bank. He's sketching out a rudimentary logo on a napkin. In one photo, he's standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders, pointing at a line of code on the screen with a look of genuine awe on his face. Back then, he looked at me like I was a magician, like I could pull miracles out of thin air. He respected the magic, even if he didn't understand the spells. And in the center of it all, like a sacred altar, was the whiteboard. My whiteboard. In the pictures, it's not a faded relic. It's alive. It's a riot of color and thought, covered from edge to edge in my sprawling handwriting. Flowcharts connected by frantic arrows, complex mathematical proofs, diagrams of server architecture that looked like the blueprints for a starship. It was the external hard drive for my brain, the physical manifestation of the beautiful, complex machine I was building in the digital world. I stopped on one particular photo. It was late, the timestamp in the corner reading 3:17 a.m. We had just gotten the call that our small business loan was approved. We'd maxed out our 3 credit cards to buy the servers that now hummed in my climate-controlled basement. We were broke, exhausted, and terrified. In the photo, Richard is standing in front of the whiteboard, his finger gently tracing the central algorithm, the one I had stayed up for 72 straight hours to perfect. He turned to me, his eyes shining with a potent mixture of ambition and belief. "Look at this," he whispered, as if he were in a church. "It's a perfect engine, Ellie. A beautiful, perfect engine. No one else in the world has one. You build this. You keep building this. I'll build the car around it, give it a coat of paint, and show it to the world. Together, we'll be unstoppable." I remember leaning my head against his shoulder, the exhaustion so profound it was almost euphoric. It wasn't his dream or my dream, it was our dream. A perfect partnership. I was the architect, he was the ambassador. I would build the truth, he would sell the story. A bitter laugh escaped my lips in the silent office 20 years later. He hadn't just sold the story. He'd started editing the author out. He'd put his own name on the cover. The perfect engine I built was now something he presented to the world as his own miraculous invention. The girl in the garage, the one who sacrificed her sleep, her health, her 20s, she didn't exist anymore. He had erased her. I closed the folder, the screen of my laptop going dark. The wave of nostalgia was gone, replaced by a glacier of cold, hard resolve. I wasn't fighting for money or a title. I was fighting for her. For the exhausted, brilliant girl in the faded sweatshirt who believed in a promise made in a dusty garage in the middle of the night. My anger wasn't hot and reckless anymore. It was focused. It was clean. It was as sharp as a line of perfect code. I picked up my phone, the screen illuminating my face in the dark. The war wasn't about what Richard was doing now. It was about what he had forgotten, and I was going to remind him. I found Ben's name in my contacts and pressed the call button. It was time to bring in my son. It was time to show the king that the architect was still in the castle. And she remembered where all the secret passages were. I called him. And in that moment, the war found its first soldier. I asked Ben to meet me the next morning at a small, quiet coffee shop near the university campus he'd graduated from. It was a neutral space, a place of anonymous students and the comforting smell of roasted coffee beans, a world away from the glass and steel cage our family called home. I needed to show him the secret passages in the castle, and I couldn't do it from inside the king's court. He arrived looking just like he always did, unassuming, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, his sharp, intelligent eyes full of concern. He thought this was about my health, or some other typical family drama. He hugged me, asked if I was okay. I just nodded and opened my laptop on the small table between us. "I need you to look at something, Ben," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, not as my son, as the head of cybersecurity for Vance Logistics. His brow furrowed in confusion, but he leaned in, I didn't start with accusations or tears. I started with the truth as I knew it, the only way I knew how. I started with the data. I showed him the screenshot of the hotel charge from the Elysian, laid out next to his father's calendar entry for the Chicago summit. He stared at it, his lips tightening. "Okay," he said slowly, already on the defensive. "So the coding is sloppy. Dad's assistant probably just mislabeled the expense." "It happens, Mom." He was looking for an easy out, a logical explanation that would keep his world intact. I couldn't blame him. "Then look at this," I said, and I pulled up the server logs. I showed him the ghost process, the hourly data bleed, the masked IP addresses. I watched his face as he processed the information. The casual concern was gone, replaced by a professional, focused intensity. He leaned closer to the screen, his fingers tracing the lines of code in the air. This was his language, his native tongue. "This is sophisticated," he murmured, his skepticism warring with his expertise. "It's designed to be invisible, but it doesn't mean it's Dad. It could be a corporate attack, a high-level breach. It's coming from inside the network, Ben, from an executive-level account, and the data packets are encrypted, military grade. I can't get through it." I held his gaze. "But you can." That was the challenge, the gauntlet thrown down. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the loyalty to his father, the man who had taught him how to throw a baseball and drive a car, versus the undeniable truth of the data staring him in the face. His professional pride, the part of him that I had nurtured, the part that couldn't stand an unsolved puzzle, won out. "All right," he sighed, pulling the laptop toward him. "Let me see." For the next hour, the coffee shop faded away. The world shrank to the 10-inch screen of my laptop and the sound of Ben's fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. He didn't work like I did, with methodical, deliberate keystrokes. He was a virtuoso, his hands a blur, opening and closing windows, writing lines of script on the fly to counter the ghost's defenses. He routed his signal through the university's servers, then bounced it off a satellite in orbit, creating a digital crowbar to pry open the encrypted files. I just sat there, watching my son, the boy I had taught to use a keyboard, now waging a silent, lightning-fast war against an enemy he couldn't yet see. Finally, he stopped. His hands fell away from the keyboard, and he stared at the screen. A single, triumphant line of green text glowed in a black command window. "Decryption complete. Accessing root directory." "I'm in," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He clicked open the first folder. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't labeled business plan or corporate strategy. It was labeled with a single name, Chloe. The first files we opened weren't documents. They were chat logs, hundreds of them. I saw a few lines of intimate, sickeningly sweet text between his father and Chloe before I looked away, my stomach turning. It wasn't the infidelity that shocked me anymore. It was the clinical, cold proof of it. But Ben kept reading, his face growing paler with every line. I watched the love and respect he had for his father curdle into disgust right before my eyes. "Mom," he started, his voice cracking. "Keep going," I said, my own voice a stranger's hard and devoid of emotion. "There's more. I know there is." He clicked on another folder, this one labeled Project Nightingale. And that's when the floor fell out from under our world. It was all there. A mirrored, slightly altered version of my original source code. A detailed business plan for selling it to an overseas competitor. Scanned copies of contracts, wire transfer agreements, and a timeline. A plan to systematically sabotage Vance Logistics from the inside after the sale, bankrupting the company and everyone who had dedicated their lives to it. And at the bottom, a personal folder with architectural plans for a new house in the Cayman Islands. Ben slumped back in his chair as if he'd been punched. The color was gone from his face. He stared at the screen, at the irrefutable digital proof that his father was not just a cheater but a traitor. A man willing to destroy his own family, his own legacy, for money and a younger woman. He was silent for a long time. I didn't rush him. I let him grieve the man he thought his father was. I watched the hurt in his eyes slowly burn away, replaced by a cold, hard fire I recognized because it was the same one burning in my own gut. Finally, he closed the laptop with a quiet, decisive snap. The sound echoed in the quiet coffee shop. He looked up from the machine, his gaze meeting mine. The boy was gone. The man, the soldier, was looking back at me. "They're not just trying to steal from you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're trying to erase you, to burn the garage down." He had understood. He had understood everything. "Yes," I whispered. He nodded once, a sharp, sudden movement. The alliance was forged. The pact was sealed in a bond of blood and broken code. "Okay," he said, his voice now clear and cold as ice. "What's the plan?" "The plan," I said, looking at my son across the small table in that coffee shop, "is that for now we do nothing. We don't confront him. We don't tip our hand. We watch, we listen, and we let them build their own cage bar by bar." And so, we became ghosts. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. On the surface, everything was sickeningly normal. I made Richard his morning coffee. I discussed dinner plans. I went to board meetings for the local art museum. Ben went to work, fixed software bugs, and nodded politely in meetings. We lived a life of quiet domestic lies. But at night, my home office transformed into a war room. The war for Vance Logistics, for my life's work, was fought in total silence, illuminated only by the glow of our monitors. Ben was brilliant. He didn't just hack his father, he became his shadow. He configured a silent, invisible packet sniffer on our home network, rerouting every bit of data from Richard's and Chloe's personal phones and laptops through a secure server he set up in my basement. It was a digital wiretap of their entire lives. Every text, every email, every late-night voice note whispered between them was captured, decrypted, and filed away. We lived in a constant stream of their deceit. We saw the secret dinner reservations, the drafts of their contracts with the overseas buyers, the callous, dismissive way they referred to me as the ghost in the machine, a relic who just kept the lights on. I bought a new whiteboard for my office. This one was clean, white, and unforgiving. While Ben gathered the ammunition, I became the general, mapping out the strategy. I drew 2 circles in the center, Richard and Chloe. From those circles, I drew lines to offshore bank accounts, to the shell corporations they'd formed, to the lawyers they had hired. It was a web of lies, and I was charting every single strand. My old whiteboard in the hall was a monument to creation. This new one was a blueprint for controlled demolition. Living the lie was the hardest part. I had to sit at dinner and listen to Richard complain about a bug in the system that Ben and I had intentionally created the night before to test their response. I had to watch him look me in the eye and lie about a late night at the office when I had a decrypted transcript of the romantic dinner he was actually having with Chloe sitting on my laptop in the next room. The rage was a physical thing, a hot coal I had to swallow every single day. The breaking point, the moment my resolve hardened from steel into something far stronger, came at our annual 4th of July barbecue. It was a perfect, all-American scene right out of a magazine. The backyard was filled with neighbors and company executives. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and charcoal from the Weber grill. Kids were running through the sprinklers, their laughter mixing with the lazy buzz of cicadas in the Texas heat. Richard was in his element, the king of his suburban castle, flipping Angus burgers with a proprietary blend of spices he claimed to have invented. He was laughing, charming, the picture of a successful family man. Chloe was there, of course. She'd brought a ridiculously expensive bottle of wine, and she moved through the party with a practiced ease, playing the part of the devoted, indispensable COO. She and Richard barely looked at each other, but I could feel the invisible current running between them. Ben and I were the only ones who could see it. We'd exchange a quick, knowing glance over the potato salad, a silent acknowledgement of the grotesque play we were being forced to watch. Then it happened. Richard, holding a cold beer, his face flushed with sun and self-satisfaction, slung his arm around Ben's shoulders. He pulled him close, a proud father showing off his son. "This is what it's all about, eh, kiddo?" he said, gesturing around the perfect yard with his beer bottle. He then nodded toward Chloe, who was chatting with our head of sales. "Your mother and I are so proud of you, but it's time for the next generation to take the lead. People with new energy, people like you and Chloe. The future of the company is in your hands." I froze, my hand clutching the plastic cup in my hand so tightly I felt it crack. He was anointing her, his mistress, his co-conspirator. He was crowning her as the future, right in front of me, in front of our son. He was handing my legacy over to the very person who was helping him destroy it, and he was doing it with a proud, oblivious smile on his face. Ben went rigid beside him. I saw his jaw clench, a muscle twitching in his cheek. But he played his part. He forced a tight smile and just nodded. Later, as Chloe was leaving, I overheard her say quietly to Richard by the garden gate, "The final transfer is set, the keynote in Austin. Once you're on that stage, it's a done deal." So now we had it, the time and the place, the final act of their treason. That night, after the last guest had left and the house was quiet again, Ben and I met in the war room. The smell of charcoal and hypocrisy still clung to our clothes. The cheerful, all-American facade of the day had been ripped away, leaving only the ugly truth. There were no more doubts, no more hesitations. The slow burn of my anger had been fanned into a forge. I walked over to my whiteboard, my battle map. I picked up a red marker, the cap making a sharp squeak in the silent room. I drew a large circle around the name of the tech conference in Austin. The time for listening was over. The time for watching was over. "They've given us the stage," I said to Ben, my voice low and cold. "Now we just have to write the final scene." They had given us the stage. Now we had to write the final scene. And for an architect, before you can build anything, even an instrument of demolition, you have to draw the blueprint. The next morning, I stood before my clean white whiteboard, a black marker in my hand. The rage and hurt from the barbecue had been transmuted overnight into a pure cold energy. I wasn't thinking about Richard or Chloe. I was thinking about logic. I was thinking about systems. I began to draw. Not a web of lies, but a flowchart. A clean, elegant, and absolutely brutal decision tree. It was the blueprint for what we started calling the kill switch. But it wasn't designed just to kill. It was designed to tell the truth. The 3 weeks leading up to the Austin Tech Conference were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. My home office, our war room, became a sanctuary of silent, focused work. It felt, in a strange way, like coming home. The cobwebs that had grown over my coding skills were swept away, and the old muscle memory came roaring back. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic clatter a familiar song I hadn't heard in years. I wasn't a wife, a mother, or a society hostess anymore. I was an engineer again, and I was building the most important piece of software of my life. I could have written a simple virus, something crude to wipe their servers or crash the presentation. But that would have been their kind of weapon, messy, chaotic, leaving room for doubt. My weapon had to be a scalpel. It had to be precise. It had to be undeniable. I worked on the core payload, a script designed to lie dormant, invisible to any security scan. But when activated, it would execute a series of commands with lightning speed. It would bypass the off-site server's firewall, access the exact folders where they kept their chat logs and the contracts with the overseas buyer, and project selected pieces of that evidence, in a prearranged sequence, onto the keynote screens. It wasn't a bomb designed to destroy the system, it was a key designed to unlock it for the whole world to see. While I built the warhead, Ben built the delivery system. He spent days analyzing the conference's presentation software, looking for a weakness, a single vulnerability. He finally found one, an obscure flaw in how the software handled embedded video files. It was the digital equivalent of an unlocked window on the 100th floor of a skyscraper. He then crafted a Trojan horse, a harmless-looking video file of the company's logo that he would embed in the presentation. But hidden within its code was my payload, the truth bomb, waiting for its trigger. The night we finished, the silence in the office felt heavy. The code was compiled, the weapon was forged. It sat in a secure folder on my desktop, a small, deceptively simple file icon that held the power to ruin lives and end an empire. I looked over at Ben. His face was pale in the glow of the monitor, his eyes shadowed with the weight of what we had created. He swiveled his chair to face me, his expression serious. "I ran the simulation a dozen times," he said, his voice quiet. "It's perfect. Once it's in their system, it's undetectable until the moment it's triggered. It will work." He paused, chewing on his lower lip. "Are you sure about this, Mom? I mean, really sure? This isn't just going to expose them. This will burn everything to the ground. The company, the stock, Dad's entire career, everything." I looked from my son's worried face to the whiteboard, at the cold, hard logic of my flowchart. I thought of the girl in the garage, of the promises made and broken, of the casual, soul-crushing disrespect I had endured for years. I thought of him anointing Chloe as the future in our own backyard. "They set the fire, Ben. I said, my voice as steady and unforgiving as the code we had just written. They poured the gasoline all over the life we built, all over my life's work. They've been holding the match for months. All I'm doing is choosing where the walls will fall to save the foundation. This isn't about burning it down. It's about saving what's mine from the ashes. He held my gaze, and I saw the last of his doubt melt away, replaced by the same cold resolve I felt. He nodded slowly. Okay, the foundation. 2 days later, an email from Chloe arrived in my inbox. Richard had forwarded it to me with a note. Ellie, can you give this a final look? Over. Just a formality. Want to make sure it looks good from a non-tech perspective. RN.GA.L. Attached was the final version of the keynote presentation, the instrument of their grand betrayal, delivered right to my digital doorstep. Ben and I sat side by side. With a few quiet keystrokes, he injected our Trojan horse, the video file with its hidden payload, into the presentation deck. He triple-checked the code. It was perfect. Invisible. Armed. I typed out a simple reply to Richard. Looks wonderful. You'll be brilliant. E. Then, with a steady hand, I attached the file and hit send. The trap was set. The bomb was delivered. All we had to do now was wait for the king to walk onto his stage and unwittingly start the countdown to the end of his own reign. And so we waited. We waited for the king to walk onto his stage and unwittingly start the countdown to the end of his own reign. The drive to Austin was the quietest 4 hours of my entire 25-year marriage. Richard sat in the passenger seat, not speaking to me, but to an invisible audience, rehearsing the key phrases of his speech under his breath. Synergy, disruptive innovation, a new paradigm. They were hollow, meaningless words, the corporate jargon he used to mask the fact that he hadn't had an original idea in a decade. I just drove, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes on the flat, endless Texas highway. I was going over my own script, my own lines of code, preparing for a much more important presentation. The convention center was a cathedral of capitalism, a sprawling temple of glass and steel teeming with 10,000 worshippers of the next big thing. Massive banners with Richard's smiling face hung from the ceiling, promising a future he had stolen. The energy was manic, a buzzing hive of ambitious young people in expensive sneakers, seasoned venture capitalists with predatory smiles, and industry press smelling for the scent of blood or money. To them, Richard was a visionary, a titan, and I was just a woman in a tastefully expensive dress, walking a few paces behind him, a shadow. We had backstage pass. I saw him in the final moments before he went on. Chloe was there, adjusting his tie, her hand lingering on his chest a second too long. They looked like a power couple, a perfectly matched set of ambition and deceit. They shared a quick, triumphant smile, a secret glance that screamed, "We did it." They thought they were on the precipice of their greatest victory. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it was breathtaking. I just stood in the shadows of a curtain, watching them, feeling nothing but a profound, empty calm. The anger had burned away, leaving behind the quiet certainty of a job that needed to be done. I found my seat. 5th row, center. Close enough to see the sweat on his brow, close enough for him to see me when the lights came up. I didn't want to be a ghost in the machine anymore. I wanted him to see the architect when the walls came down. I sat there, a small island of stillness in a restless sea of people, and looked at the vast, empty stage. I had spent my life building the platform he stood on. I had designed it, engineered it, and stress-tested it. It was only fitting that I should be the one to pull the lever on the trapdoor. The house lights dimmed. A deep, throbbing bass shook the floor, and a slick corporate video filled the 8 Kelvin screens. It was a montage of smiling employees, futuristic graphics, and soaring drone shots of our shipping hubs. It was a beautiful, expensive, and utterly soulless piece of propaganda. It was the story he sold, not the truth I had built in the garage. Then, he walked out. The applause was thunderous, a physical wave of sound. He strode to the center of the stage, bathed in a single white spotlight, and spread his arms wide, accepting the adoration. A rock star, a visionary, a liar. He began to speak, his voice smooth and confident, weaving the familiar tale of our company's humble beginnings. He didn't mention the garage, he never did anymore. He talked about a singular vision, a relentless drive, and a spark of an idea, my drive, my vision. As he spoke, I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. There was no tremor of fear or doubt. Ben had designed a simple, elegant app for me. When I opened it, the screen was black, displaying nothing but a single pulsing green button. It was shaped like the power symbol on a computer, the universal icon for turning things on or off. Beneath it, a single word in clean white text: execute. I looked from the button back to the man on the stage. He was building to his crescendo, his voice rising with passion. He was selling them the future, a future built on the bones of my past. I thought of the whiteboard, covered in my frantic, joyful equations. I thought of the girl in the sweatshirt, so full of hope and belief in the man standing beside her. He had taken her work, her sacrifice, her very identity, and repackaged it for public consumption. And in that moment, I felt a deep, cleansing pity for him. He had become a hollow vessel, a charismatic shell with nothing original left inside. My thumb rested lightly on the cool glass of the screen, right over the pulsing green button. My heart wasn't racing. My breathing was even. The slow burn was over. The years of quiet resentment, the weeks of cold fury, the days of meticulous planning had all led to this single silent moment. Checkmate was on the board. All I had to do was move the final piece. The Queen's Gambit. He took a deep breath, his chest swelling with pride, and delivered the final triumphant line of his speech. The line I had programmed into the heart of my logic bomb. The trigger. And with logics too, he declared, his arms spreading wide as if to embrace the world. We are not just building on the past, we are building a truly new foundation for the future. My thumb, which had been resting on the cool glass of my phone, pressed down. It was a simple, quiet gesture, a single tap, a single bit of data sent into the ether, an imperceptible action that, in the next 3 seconds, would cause a supernova. On stage, Richard beamed, waiting for the new company logo to explode onto the screens behind him in a blaze of glory. Instead, the screens flickered. They went from the deep blue of the corporate branding to a jarring, staticky gray. A low hum of confusion rippled through the 10,000 people in the audience. Richard's smile tightened. He tapped the clicker in his hand, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He thought it was a technical glitch. He had no idea the system was performing exactly as it was designed to. Then the first image appeared. It was a screenshot of a text message magnified 50 feet high for the world to see, from Rick to Chlo. The text read, "The ghost is out for the afternoon. My office in 20?" A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, sucked the air out of the room. I saw Richard's face drain of all color. He looked like he'd been electrocuted. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe, standing by the side of the stage, physically recoil as if she'd been slapped. The screen flickered again. A new message, this one a direct quote from their encrypted chat logs. CHLOE. "Is the board going to be a problem?" Rick. "Don't worry. The board is me, and my wife, she just signs what I tell her to." A low growl of anger started to build in the crowd. People were standing up, pulling out their phones, the small lights of 1,000 cameras now pointed at the stage. The screens changed again, this time to something everyone in the room understood: money. It was a rapid-fire montage of illegal wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Screenshots of contracts with the overseas competitor, their logo clearly visible. The conspiracy was laid bare, not with accusations, but with cold, hard, irrefutable proof. The VCs in the front row were on their feet, their faces masks of fury, already yelling into their phones. Richard was a statue, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it was almost silent. He looked completely and utterly broken. But I wasn't done yet. The financial betrayal was for the investors. The romantic betrayal was for the gossip columns. The final reveal, that was for me. The damning contracts vanished, replaced by a single powerful image that silenced the entire room. It was a split screen. On the left, the grainy photo of me from 20 years ago, asleep at my desk in the garage, the half-eaten slice of pizza a testament to my exhaustion and dedication. On the right, a screenshot of the original source code for the routing algorithm, the digital DNA of Vance Logistics. And at the bottom of the code, clearly visible, was the author's timestamp from 2 decades ago and my name, Eleanor Vance. A new wave of murmurs swept the crowd, but this one was different. It was a sound of dawning realization, of understanding. The story they had been told for years was a lie. The king was a fraud. The ghost in the machine had just appeared on screen, and she was the one who had built the palace. The split screen held for a long, painful 10 seconds, burning the truth into the retinas of the entire tech industry. Then, it all went black. For a single heartbeat, the only sound in the cavernous hall was the frantic clicking of 100 press cameras. And then the final lines appeared. No pictures, no numbers, just simple, white text on a black background. An epitaph for Richard's career. Vance Logistics, algorithm, architecture, and IP. Property of Eleanor Vance. Founder's clause invoked. That was it, my final move, the Queen's Gambit. It wasn't just revenge, it was a hostile takeover executed with a single line of code. Pandemonium erupted. People were shouting. Security guards were rushing the stage, not to protect Richard, but to contain the chaos. He just stood there, a hollow man in an expensive suit, as the empire he had stolen crumbled into dust around him. His eyes, full of a terrifying, pleading panic, finally found mine in the crowd. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I just looked at him. I gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. A final sign-off. The project was complete. Then I stood up, turned my back on the beautiful, glorious chaos I had created, and walked out of the auditorium. The foundation was secure. The castle was mine again. I walked out of the auditorium into a different world. The castle was mine again, but the battle wasn't over. It had just spilled out into the streets. The chaos I had unleashed in that room was now a wildfire, and the lobby of the convention center was the first forest to catch flame. It was a cacophony of sound and light. People were clustered in tight, frantic groups, their faces illuminated by the screens of their phones. The air, once buzzing with polite networking, was now crackling with the raw energy of a massive scandal breaking in real time. I could hear snippets of conversation as I moved through the crowd. Did you see that? He just stood there. All over Twitter, the hashtag number Vance Vindication is already trending. Send me the video, I can't believe it. The news was moving at the speed of light, and I was the only person in the room who wasn't surprised. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like a physicist watching a predictable chain reaction she had initiated. My path took me past the massive media wall that had been displaying the conference schedule just an hour before. Now, every screen was tuned to CNBC. A breathless anchor was talking a mile a minute, her face a mask of professional excitement. But my eyes were on the graphic beside her head, our company's stock ticker, VLGX. It was a brutal slash of red, a plunging line that looked like an EKG of a dying patient. -20%, -30%, -45%. I stood there for a moment, watching as hundreds of millions of dollars of market capitalization evaporated into thin air. A lifetime of work, it seemed, was being erased in seconds. But I knew the truth. It wasn't value being destroyed, it was a lie being corrected. The market was recalibrating the price of a story that had just been proven false. I saw a group of our senior VPs huddled near a pillar, their faces pale and sweaty. They weren't strategizing. They were panicking, shouting into their phones, their words a frantic mix of damage control and disbelief. No, I had no idea. The board has to issue a statement. Our shareholders are going to slaughter us. These were the men who had basked in Richard's reflected glory for years. The yes, men who had enabled his grand deception. And now they were like rats on a sinking ship. Then, the main doors of the auditorium burst open, and the true chaos began. A wave of reporters and cameramen surged forward, a frantic, shouting mob. In the center of the storm was Richard. 2 security guards were trying to carve a path for him, but they were failing. He was no longer the king of the stage. He was a cornered animal, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. The popping of camera flashes was like a volley of gunfire. The shouted questions were a barrage of verbal assaults. Mr. Vance, is it true you committed securities fraud? What is your comment on the impending SEC investigation? Was your wife the real founder of the company? Is it true about you and the COO? He stumbled, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken. He was being consumed by the very media machine he had so expertly manipulated for 2 decades. As the swarm pushed him past me, I saw a flash of something else in his eyes. He wasn't just scared, he was confused. He still didn't understand how the architect he had locked in the attic had managed to burn down his house. Through a gap in the crowd, I caught a glimpse of Chloe. She wasn't afforded the protection of a security detail. She was being unceremoniously escorted out a side exit by a single, grim-faced guard, like a disgraced intern. Her perfect hair was a mess. Her makeup was a disaster of tear-streaked mascara. Her ambition had carried her to the second highest seat in a billion-dollar company, and it had all been undone in less than 5 minutes. She looked up and her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. I saw no fight in them, only the hollow, empty look of complete and utter defeat. And while every camera, every eye, every ounce of attention was focused on the spectacular implosion of their lives, I just kept walking. No one noticed me. No one recognized me. To this crowd, I was still a ghost, a name on a screen. I moved through the pandemonium with a calm I hadn't felt in years, the eye of my own hurricane. I had spent so long being invisible, a silent partner in my own life. Now, that same invisibility was my shield, allowing me to walk away from the wreckage unscathed. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, indifferent heat of the Texas Sunday. The sounds of the media-feeding frenzy faded behind me, replaced by the distant drone of city traffic. I took a deep breath. The air didn't feel electric or charged with victory. It just felt clean. The surgery had been a success. The malignant tumor of lies had been cut out, cauterized in the most public way imaginable. The recovery could now begin. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever came next, I would be building it on a foundation of truth. My truth. Building on a foundation of truth is a messy business. The week after the conference was a whirlwind of lawyers, emergency board meetings, and the relentless 24-hour glare of the global media. The story had exploded. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was, according to one headline, the architect who seized her castle. They painted me as a ruthless mastermind, a wronged wife, a feminist icon. The truth was simpler. I was just a builder who had finally decided to evict a tenant who had stopped paying rent. The legal battle I had braced for never came. It turned out the strongest walls in my castle were the ones I had built at the very beginning. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Anya, had found it buried deep in the original articles of incorporation I had drafted myself 20 years ago. The Founder's Clause. A little piece of legal code I had insisted on, giving the original IP holder me majority voting control in the event of gross corporate malfeasance by the acting CEO. At the time, Richard had laughed it off as my paranoid engineering brain at work. Now, it was his checkmate. The emergency board meeting was a somber affair. The remaining members, the ones not immediately implicated in the fraud, sat around the long mahogany table looking like men waiting for their own execution. I didn't say a word. I let Anya do the talking, laying out the clause, the evidence of the conspiracy, and the undeniable fact that I held the company's future in the palm of my hand. There was no debate. The vote to remove Richard as CEO and install me as his replacement was unanimous. It wasn't a victory, it was a formality, a correction of a long-standing error in the system. The final confrontation with Richard happened a few days later, not in a boardroom or a home, but in the neutral beige purgatory of a lawyer's office. He looked 10 years older. The charisma was gone, stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, haggard man I barely recognized. The expensive suit hung on his thinner frame. He tried to speak as I sat down across the table from him. "Ellie, His voice was a dry rasp, full of a self-pity I no longer had the energy to acknowledge. I held up a hand, a small, simple gesture that stopped him cold. There were no more words, no more lies, no more empty apologies. All the talking had been done, broadcast on a 50-foot screen in front of the entire world. I simply slid the divorce papers across the polished table, a thick stack of documents that represented the final deletion of him from my life. He stared at them, his jaw working silently. Then, with a hand that trembled slightly, he picked up the pen and signed his name. His signature, once the bold, confident scrawl of a king, was now the weak, spidery mark of a defeated man. As he was about to leave, the door opened and Ben walked in. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on his father. He wasn't there to yell or to cry. He was there to close a chapter. "I spent my entire life looking up to you," Ben said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a collapsing mountain. "Trying to be the man you were. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure I'm nothing like you." Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. Ben placed a small cardboard box on the table. It contained a few personal items from Richard's office, a framed photo of him with a politician, a ridiculously expensive pen, a golf trophy. The cheap, flimsy box was the sum total of his legacy. Then my son turned and walked out of the room without another word. That, I knew, was the blow Richard would never recover from. The loss of his son's respect was a consequence far greater than the loss of his company or his wife. My first day as CEO, I walked into the office on the top floor. It was a monument to Richard's ego. The walls were covered in framed magazine covers of his face. Trophies for Man of the Year and Innovator of the Decade cluttered the shelves. I had the movers box it all up. "Take all of this to a storage unit," I told them. Then I pointed to the large, empty wall behind the massive desk. "I have something I want to put there." An hour later, they brought it up. My old, faded whiteboard from the garage. They mounted it on the wall, its surface a beautiful, chaotic tapestry of my old equations and diagrams. It looked completely out of place in the sleek, corporate office, and yet it was the only thing that had ever truly belonged there. It was a reminder to anyone who walked into that office, myself included, of where the real work was done and where the real value came from. Ben came in and stood beside me. We looked at the whiteboard, then out the panoramic window at the city skyline stretching to the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. It felt like a sunrise. "A lot of work to do," Ben said softly, more a statement than a question. "Yes," I said, "a lot of rebuilding." I wasn't the girl in the garage anymore, and I wasn't the ghost in the machine. I was the founder. I was the CEO. And I was finally, after all these years, exactly where I was supposed to be, the architect, back in charge of her own castle.